The Origins of the American Revolution, Part 2. This is the second of 4 lectures on the origins of the American Revolution. In Part 1, we left off with the conclusion of the French and Indian War and the problems that the British Empire faced in British North America. Specifically, the problems were, following the war, immense war debt, difficulties in administering and defending their new territories, and the question, where would the British Empire find money to govern this new huge empire? The British Parliament decided to move aggressively to address these 3 major problems. And in this frame of mind, Britain moved vigorously. First, it tried to halt westward movement of the colonials into the interior, because that migration produced costly Indian wars. So the British Parliament attempted to limit American movement. All colonial land claims west of the Appalachian Mountains were voided, and Britain kept control of the land. This was controversial because it took away independent economic activity from settlers who were already in the region. The fur trade was taken out of independent hands and put under centralized British control, irritating the trappers. The British Parliament's first attempt to regulate this movement came with a law in 1763. It was called the Proclamation Line of 1763. A line was drawn along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, and the law decreed that colonists were not to go westward beyond this boundary. The British Parliament just expected the American settlers to obey. No surveys were taken, no boundary markers were put up. The British officials just expected the colonists not to move westward. The American settlers moved westward anyway. In 1764, the controversial Sugar Act was passed by the Parliament. Its official name was the American Revenue Act of 1764, and it was a law that modified an already existing law, the Molasses Act of 1733, which regulated sugar traffic with the French West Indies. However, this law had never been enforced, following what the British parliamentarian Edmund Burke called salutary neglect, which meant that a law was on the books, but it simply was not enforced. This act, though, the Sugar Act, was the first law ever passed by Parliament specifically to raise money in the colonies to pay off debts. And unlike the Molasses Act of 1733, this act would be enforced. The Sugar Act actually cut the existing tax in half, but now the tax would be collected, the law would be enforced. When the Sugar Act was passed, American colonial commercial interests were puzzled by this action. The Sugar Act did not raise enough money to pay off the debts that the British Empire faced, so in 1765 they passed the even more controversial Stamp Act. Under this act, from this point onward, all official government documents, business licenses, marriage licenses, revenue stamps on bottles of liquor, even playing cards and newspapers, had to be printed on paper, official paper, that had an embossed stamp. And if the paper was not used, the documents were not legal. So this was a tax on newspapers, licenses, legal papers, and many other documents. No stamps were ever sold or used. No paper was ever printed. And yet, when this announcement was made, the colonists were outraged. It was taxation without consent. The American colonists had simply not been consulted about this revenue-enhancing action. Critics said that Great Britain was insensitive, and that their action was surprising in light of the fact that much of British parliamentary history, even an English Civil War, was fought in part over control of taxation by elected representatives, not imposition from on high. But the Parliament thought that the American colonists were children that should obey and not protest. Prominent British parliamentarian Charles Townshend, who later became Chancellor of the Exchequer, essentially equivalent to our Secretary of the Treasury, made a famous quotation at the time. He said this, quote, "And now will these Americans, children planted by our care, nourished up by our indulgence until they are grown to a degree of strength and opulence, and protected by our arms, will they grudge to contribute their tiny tax to relieve us from the heavy weight of that burden of debt and taxes which we lie under?" Unquote. However, many of the colonists were not simply ungrateful children, and the colonial reaction was swift and sure. In Part 3 of this lecture, we will take a look at the colonial reaction and how it triggered events that would ultimately lead to the American Revolutionary War.